Okay, welcome. This is our monthly gathering call. Today is October 18th. And, when you're raising children or working with children and their parents, these things happen where they're totally out of your control and you had your best plan moving forward and then something completely sweeps you off your feet. That's a good example of what's happening today, like in the last 25 minutes here. So, for those of you who are new to me, I'm Samantha Moe, a certified parent coach and a national speaker. Sometimes you come to this call because you're looking for ways to calm your child's challenging behavior, or maybe you're looking for more context. How do I understand what's going on beneath behavior? Maybe your child has anxiety or they have some type of a diagnosis. And what I find with people who come to these calls is you tend to be a mixture of parents or professionals who work with kids and families. And really, what we're doing here together is we're gathering to say we have a heart for children, we have a heart to make life better. And for the most part, what I like to do during this call is I like to help create a perspective that when we're trying to improve a child's experience, it's not just about the child, it's also about ourselves as the grown-ups in the room. It's also about the nervous system that your child has and what's causing explosive reactions in the first place. And guess what? Since we're on this path, the same thing is true for our own nervous systems. So, I'm going to roll with what is, since I know that's true to life. I have a 4-year-old myself. I'm pointing as if you can see my kid upstairs since I'm in the basement recording this today. But I want to just invite us to take a moment and recognize that, okay, we'll be on a call for 30 to 40 minutes. And sometimes for adult learning, those snippets to tune in and reconnect with ourselves and each other is good enough. And I caught myself today saying it rather than like, good enough, which kind of feels like, I'm not doing the best job I can. Let's actually just say, like, how you're showing up today is good. It's good. All right. So, as we move into reflection time and trying to understand our child and ourselves so that we can make strides in a positive direction for our family, what I want to do is invite you to do something called a neurovascular hold. This is something I've learned from my good friend Kathy Flaminio, who teaches Move Mindfully in the Minneapolis, St. Paul, Minnesota public schools, as well as many other places. And the neurovascular hold is front of your forehead and back of your head. And this is a trauma healing hold. So as you do this for yourself right now, the point of this is not just to keep moving about your day, but it's to take a moment, whether you're here live or you're accessing the replay, to check in with yourself, to realize that we're not just thoughts and plans and schedules, but like we're a body too. And so this helps us notice where we are right now. Now, my shoulders get tired, so if you want to move your hand to your heart, that's an appropriate place to put it as well. And noticing your feet or whatever's grounding you down right now. Maybe it's your seat in a chair. Even if you're going for a walk or you're doing something that's kind of chore-like around the home, if you're going to keep moving, slow it down or just pause for a moment. And as you take a breath, noticing, we're trying to gather ourselves into ourselves as well because of all the details that can be flying around in any given moment. And as you ground yourself, ask, why is it important for me to share time here today? I know that we're slowing things down. Sometimes when I listen to podcasts, when they're doing the mindfulness thing, I fast forward it, put it on 2x speed, and don't actually take that moment to reflect. And there's days that we do that. But why is it important for you to be here today? And if you're with me live, feel free to type that in the chat box. And I'm going to start making some guesses and give you a roadmap of what I wanted to talk about today. So I already shared one of the reasons why people come talk to me on these calls. Sometimes you've been referred by an OT or a mental health professional for your child or by a friend, or you've heard me speak because I'm often hired by large corporations like hospitals and or like medical systems to work with nurses and pediatricians and the large target corporation to work with working parents, and then like crunchy mom groups as well. So there's a big variety and reason that might have brought you here. But I want you to remember a recent situation of, actually, not a recent situation. I want you to remember a situation where you first felt like your role was really hard. So it might be really hard right now, but go back with me and remember, what was the time that was really hard? And how did you feel when that happened? Were you mad about it? Were you shocked? Did you feel rage, disbelief? Did you feel sad, hopeless, powerless, or something different? Did you feel hopeful? Did you feel bright-eyed and bushy-tailed? Did you feel the possibility of what could shift if only you had the right tools or applied yourself or focused or had the emotional support network in your family, in your community, in your friendship circle? And if you haven't heard me talk before, I'm just not going to do my regular spiel about what it is that I stand for, like the long version of it. And that is that when we're seeing challenging behaviors, it's an indicator of fight or flight stress response. And you see me shrugging. It's kind of like this plainness that's straightforward, but not so easy to wrap our arms around. So when fight or flight stress response is high in a child, it begins to give us a way of looking at the situation and asking, how do I respond when fight or flight stress is high? Or the piece that I really stand for, and I will show you an image of this, is that when there's a fire in your child's brain, that's what I call fight or flight stress response, because it's like you can try all the tools you want in that moment, but if there's a fire in the brain and you see that the downstairs brain is running the show, our tools of, let me solve this problem, let's talk our kid through it, let's talk them down, let's cause them to focus and say, hey, pay attention, I have the right tool to guide you through this or to navigate this moment, or like, stop being so distractible and wild and upset, like just pay attention because we're going to navigate this. Or you might even have really great behavioral management tools that work really well proactively, but they haven't yet worked in the moment. It's not quite working when it's time for your child to wind down and go to bed. It's not working when you're out in public and there's been a full day and there's overstimulation and your child really, really, really is begging for you to buy them something. When there's fire in the brain, let me just pop back over to my notes here. I think I stopped screen sharing. But when there is this fire in the brain, what I want to let you know is that your child is having it, and we would be missing a really big piece of the puzzle if we only looked at the tools to calm challenging behavior. Now, as a certified parent coach since 2012, as an autism specialist and behavior specialist and social skills expert since 2004, when I got my master's in communication disorders, I want to share that when we're talking about calming challenging behaviors, we never, I really like a bottom up plan. How do we calm fire in the brain in order to walk our way up into our kids having their own problem solving skills? How do we help our kids develop self-regulation? Because now they're able to stop and think and look around them. In some cases, children are able to read the room better or read the situation better and overcome overwhelm. They're able to take breaths. They're able to snuggle into you. They're able to stop self-injurious behavior or pause before engaging in it. And so when you have tools and a plan, we start recognizing that when our child is having a hard moment, it's not that they won't listen and that they're defiant and that they're intentionally making the situation or your life worse. I have to laugh when I say that. Because we think that, right? We're like, you're just trying to make my life hard. I had this coming to me. I should have learned these tools 10 years ago. I had my own trauma. of course, it makes sense that now that I'm doing my own therapy work, all of this is getting stirred up and it's too much to navigate. Shame on me. I should have done something better. Like we're so good as grown-ups at going down that negative self-talk spiral. But really, what I want to invite you to is that this moment that we're in right now is the right moment to be tapping into this conversation and learning whatever nugget it is that's going to relate to you here today. And if, as we start talking about nuggets, if this is valuable and you feel like you want to engage more in the plan, you might know that as the creator of Mad to Glad, I teach 8 pillars of parenting and our program starts next Wednesday. So it's kind of like you got a few more days to sign up if you wanted to join or ask questions about that program. When we start understanding where kids' frustration or dysregulation is coming from this perspective as a parent, not just why is there autism, not just, but why is my kid avoiding any type of authority I might have over them. We're seeing symptoms of pathological demand avoidance. Well, why is there a leaky gut and food sensitivities? And what do we need to do to fix their detox pathways? Like there's so many things to look at and so many specialists out there. And the reason I host these gathering calls is because this is the place for you as a parent, not to solve the big questions of why is there a diagnosis or inflammatory behavior in the first place, but how can I see this situation as a parent in a way where we can make it better instead of adding fuel to the fire and making it worse? All right. So Connie, if there's anything resonating with you, I'm going to have you stay on mute for now, but feel free to type in the chat box because I know you've been to more than one of my classes. So let me know if there's anything relating with you right now. Relating to you right now. And what I want to share is that when we're looking at behavior, you know what I usually teach the professional who's working with your kids? Because I have a partnership with Fraser and with Minnesota Association for Children's Mental Health. There are professionals in these agencies around Minnesota who are learning how to teach my 8 pillars of parenting so they can run it in their communities. And there's 3 things I usually talk about with professionals. I say, but I'm going to share it with you, even though the majority of you listening to this are going to be parents. It's that you want to understand your kid and where their behavior, what's happening underneath their behavior, but you also want to understand yourself. And so parents, we don't usually hear this conversation. The people who are helpers in your life, the mental health clinicians, the teachers, the holistic and medical practitioners, they might be thinking and talking around the lunch table or in team meetings and case studies about what's happening with the parents. But I want to talk to you about that because that's a good conversation to be looped into. So, what's happening underneath kids' behaviors, but what's happening underneath parent behaviors? And when we can learn to evaluate both for our own family or to have this conversation with a family that we're working with, this is where the transformation is because there's honesty and there's embracing what's real. And sometimes when we know the truth of, I had a schedule and my kid was doing really well with it. And then we fell off the schedule because there was school and then somebody got sick and then the next person in the family got sick and then the life was really busy and then there was a harvest moon looking out my window. Like whatever the reasons are, if we can learn to acknowledge what is the truth of what's happening right now, it can take some of that blame and that perfectionism of we have to fix it now. Fix my kid, fix myself, fix my self-talk. Instead, we get to gather, we get to wrap each other. Like I get to wrap you in a hug during this gathering call and say, well, why don't we just talk about both? Because the number one thing that parents are missing when there's really challenging behaviors at home is oftentimes parents are missing, what am I doing that adds fuel to the fire? And maybe you know. So take a moment and reflect or type in the chat box. What are you doing that adds fuel to your kid's fire? Even before I've taught you my 11 fire starters, places we unintentionally trigger children's behavior and negative moods, what do you think adds fuel to your kid's fire? My child's having a hard time separating with me. And this has happened over the years, particularly in the early morning. He wants me to wake him up. And I'm strong in creating secure attachment. And if my workout schedule in the morning has to be a home workout for 30 minutes instead of 60 minutes at the gym, which of course is going to include another 30 minutes of driving total back and forth, then if I have to change my life, like that's what parenting is for me. That's for me, that secure attachment and being present. That's really important. And at the same time, there are phases like yesterday where my child was clinging because he didn't want me to go for a walk for 20 minutes. And on Thursdays, I don't work at all. We call it family day. My husband's at home as well. He's an entrepreneur. And and we just hang out and we do stuff as a family. Sometimes it's projects, sometimes it's errands, sometimes we're doing a fall detox. So it's like preparing bone broth and nourishing foods that we're going to be eating for the next 5 days. But I had this moment where Mason was pulling on me, and I knew, like for a degree of time, I get low and I slow down and I do extra snuggles and I push my exercise a little bit, but then I knew I was going to spend the rest of the day with him. And I remember like moving my sleeve out of his grasp quickly like that. And then he like chased me down the hall, which created, he was more clingy because and I saw the mirror when I was walking by and I had this, like these lines in between my eyes and I was like, ah, I need to go exercise. I'm always laughing after I talk about these hard moments because I'm not in that moment now. And it's so real, right? Where you snap at your kid or you give them. I looked in the mirror. I'm like, that is an ugly face that I just gave him. Of course, now, instead of me taking the time to help him transition or let me transition, of course, now he's screaming and running after me and he's elevated because he's got more like fight or flight stress going on in his brain, more adrenaline, more cortisol. So the number one thing that parents are often missing is understanding what am I doing that adds fuel to the fire? So in the simplest form, how is your tone? Is it nasty? What kind of words are you using? And let me say like, because working in this field for 20 years has been such a blessing because I get to always evaluate, especially when I'm running my 8-week series that starts next week. I get to always evaluate my parenting and polish these pillars, polish my own sense of calm and groundedness and self care before my child wakes up so that I can be present for him and not slip into nasty tone or words or mood. So when you're considering what is it that you might be doing that adds fuel to the fire, what I want to share is that the other consideration is why do we act that way? One of the incredible gifts, again, of parent coaching is that in this space, you get to be asked questions about yourself. You get to slow it down and take the time and I'm not a mental health clinician. I'm not a therapist, licensed therapist. So why are you acting that way? And you might say something like, well, I'm acting that way. I mean, here's what I would say. I'd say, well, I'm acting this way because we've been working on this since my kid was 10 months old and I first started going back to morning workouts. I'm tired of this. I feel like I just want my space. I want it to be easier. And considering for you, if I'm making guesses, because I've worked with over 1,000 families and certified coming up to 100 clinicians in the Mad to Glad curriculum, why might you act that way? Well, there's a lot of us who are overscheduled. And so we're trying to run a tight ship because we don't actually have the time set aside to do the things that make us feel good. And you might say, well, I would do the things that made me feel good if I had more support in my life, but everything falls on my shoulders. And so then we get to consider that as well. Okay. I'm never going to ask the room like, well, how do you drop some of that? How do you stop some of that? Because we come to a complete impasse. Like that's not a good question for our brains because we're running on ragged sometimes because we feel like we have to. There can be an adrenal addiction for us as grown-ups from stressful childhood that becomes our baseline, like adrenaline. Or we might have financial stresses. So we're like, I got to do this. I got to do this. I'm always trying to like get over the hump in order to have that spaciousness. So there can be lots of reasons why we don't shift into presence. And what I like about these longer calls compared to my Instagram posts of that might give you a 30 or 60 minute tip on how to reflect on your own behavior as parents and understand your child's behavior is that we get to really consider this. And here's what I find. Why do we as parents add fuel to the fire? Well, one of them, to be really honoring of you, is that we slip into that mode of adding fuel to the fire because we don't understand that the impact we have on kids with our own behavior is really in our, like, what do I want to say? That what you do matters. Sometimes we don't realize that what we do matters. And when you're thinking about like a child who has more of this fiery brain, more fight response, more flight response, more freeze response, they can't move on. Well, that's going to trigger what it feels like inside of you. And that's because of something called mirror neurons. So as I share this image of mirror neurons, just to give a quick description, mirror neurons reflect the state another person is in. So these are actual brain neurons. So why are you adding fuel to the fire? Well, when your child is ticked off and grabbing at you and trying to control you, that's going to trigger some of those feelings in you of wanting to not have to give up control, of wanting to be in control. And this is kind of the hard part about parenthood that's not always talked about. Thank goodness for books like, I'm going to curse just so you know if a child is listening to this, but there's a book called Night Bitch that talks about this mother's journey of her whole life revolving around our kid. This is a memoir, but not a true story because it's talking about how she transforms into a dog. But she's using this metaphor of how the challenges of parenthood are transforming her and tapping her into this wild animalistic part of her. So in parenting, that's a real thing that happens. And if we don't talk about that, if we don't realize that when our child is raging, it stirs rage up in us, we might be operating under a different belief system of who we really are. We might say, well, I was always polite. I never was prone to anger. I've always been promoted at work. I get these high responsibility roles, but then it falls apart at home. Why are we acting that way with our kids? Well, it's mirror neurons. Kids run the gamut of emotions, and those mirror neurons are going to reflect the state that they're in. And if you haven't had experience becoming aware that you have those feelings too, and what do you do with those feelings? It's not that different than children who are dysregulated, who don't have the words yet to understand their feelings, and don't have the tools yet to work through the feelings. And that's what we do in this parenting space. We acknowledge our feelings and we understand that what we do matters with our kids. And you're being invited to climb a mountain to behave, to respond, to have control of yourself in ways that sometimes our culture doesn't promote. Sure, like inspirational quotes promote that, but does your family promote understanding your child? Does the generation older than you promote, well, understand where the kid is coming from and then collaborate with them? Honor the child's need to have a slowed pace. Recognize and reward your child's childhood by doing fewer things, by sitting on the floor and playing if that's within your physical abilities. All right. So I'm just pausing here. Sometimes some of these concepts just come through. I want to reorganize myself. So, why do we act certain ways with our kids, and why are our kids acting certain ways with us? Well, while sometimes we never get to the root, some of the root is you yourself might have anxious relationships. There could have been something in your own childhood that created a sense of insecurity. And so you try to create control in relationships. Well, that's really comes to the surface and becomes visible when we're in significant partnership. Raising children is also, I would say, considered significant partnership if we choose to see parenting that way. And when we're looking at other reasons that we might be really reactive to our child is, in some ways, the easy thing is understanding what are the tools. When I'm teaching 8 pillars, it's like, all right, so let me avoid fire starters. Let's build happy chemicals. Let's label emotions. Let's create a positive discipline structure. Let's talk about conflict resolution so kids learn to rely on us less and we don't have to step in and solve their problems. Like that's the the path of parenthood. If you're raising kids who or have the goal of raising kids who are self-regulated and able to form cooperative partnership with you, that feels really nice for both of you. Uh, Empowered parent, empowered child. But sometimes the reason that we're acting in ways that we're not proud of is because we don't have much capacity. There was a dad of a 4-year-old I worked with once. The boy was autistic, probably 15 years ago. And I asked him, I was a speech language pathologist at the time, and I said, I'm leaving this corporate field. I'm starting my own business soon. I've shared a different idea on how you can relate to Drew positively and build his communication so that he's talking through things rather than acting things out. He's requesting items instead of grabbing them. He's saying, I'm mad, or ask for help instead of hitting and screaming. And I said, for the last several weeks and months, you've come in and your language has changed. Instead of, I can't get my kid to do this home program, your language has shifted to, he won't do it. And now um, he can't do it. And so I don't even try anymore. And so I was asking him, why are you relying on me as the specialist rather than you as the parent? And he said, something I've never shared with you is that I have chronic leukemia. So dad had this chronic condition where it took all of his capacity to bring his child in to see a helper after the school day, to run and go get groceries, to go home and cook a meal to put food on the table for the 3 children and himself and his partner. And so sometimes what can be really challenging is to understand that there are phases where we can't do more. And so if you're in that phase, I honor you for showing up and putting more knowledge in your brain. It's probably an important step to move in the direction of the vision that you have for how you want to be as a parent and the future that you want for your child. And it's also a real thing where sometimes you need to lay down and rest. You need to make yourself unavailable when you're not absolutely required to be on a meeting or be attending to a child. It's not absolutely necessary to make the perfect meal. Can you turn things off and shut down and go under the covers and sleep? So when we're reactive, sometimes it's less about having a tool to use and doing more. And it's like, honor your own freezy business. That's what freeze mode is called by Steve Hoskinson of Organic Intelligence, which is a trauma resolution program for adults. I went through it a couple years ago. It's wonderful. And then another reason that we act in ways that we feel not proud of or that might be kind of nasty is because we have some pieces of the equation, but not all of them. So if you've ever been on my YouTube channel, I have a parent testimonial playlist where parents share their stories anywhere from 5 to 20 minutes long. And Lacey shares a story there about gentle parenting, how she kept digging deep. Her child was having a tantrum in the morning. She'd spend 40 to 50 minutes sitting next to him, not forcing his shoes on, acknowledging his feelings, leading with empathy. And in the meantime, the collateral was that the toddler wasn't getting playtime. The toddler was having to be in this circumstance too because mom was doing her very best to be a gentle parent. And she listened to the podcast and they just encourage her, like, go deep, hang in there, like, stay there longer. And there's a parenting model I really like called aware parenting that talks about be aware, hold space for your kids' feelings. But the other thing I know about intense brain kids is that we also want to have limits because we have limits. there's a limit where you come across there's a threshold where you're like, I can't hold this space empathetically anymore. It's kind of like there was something about sleep coaching that I remember learning about. Sometimes I'm a guest speaker on Kim West with her sleep coach, gentle sleep coach community. And we talk about like the threshold of ability that you have, and you want to make sure that before you do something like a gentle sleep program, that you have the support and the ability to follow through with it. Well, for me, when I'm thinking about challenging behaviors, the ability, I don't feel like it's talked about enough that in gentle parenting, it's not having enough ability to sit there while your child holds you hostage, which is what it often can feel like in some moments. But it's also saying, I know my limit before I scream back, or before I throw the shoes, or before I threaten and I go into the car and I scare him because I'm like, toddler's good in the car, you better come or else you're going to be home alone. Well, if you've already crossed that threshold and you're at um, um, the doorstep of that behavior that creates more fire in the brain, fight or flight, fear, adrenaline, cortisol, well, it makes sense to me that we layer in more tools of how do we follow through with boundaries. And so sometimes the reason we're being really reactive isn't because we're not trying nothing. It's because we're missing a piece of the puzzle. And that's a lot of what I talk about, of course, in Mad to Glad. So my intention today was to create a space to have this conversation for parents about what is parenting like, what's happening with my child's behavior. And if you are wanting to unmute and just have a conversation, we have some time remaining that we can certainly do that, Connie. And for those of you who feel like I'm listening to this replay and I'm curious about these programs, I'll just mention briefly that you can find my 11 fire starter behaviors on my website at the bottom of the page, samanthamo.com. I can screen share that too. That's really simple if you're looking for a starting point. And then the other thing is if you're thinking you want some support, if you want these 8 tools so that you know what your plan can be and figure out what are the pieces that you're missing, I start a live cohort that I lead twice a year on Wednesday, October 23rd. So that's going to include an online module pre-assignment. And then we meet for up to 75 minutes and we talk about how exactly do you apply this tool in your family. And it's really great because um, it's a group dynamic on Zoom, so you get to hear other parents ask questions and you get to hear me coach through it, just like you might get to if Connie decides to unmute in a minute. And so if you're interested in that program, you'll see on my website that option 1 talks about your self-paced um, Mad to Glad curriculum if you wanted to access that. But the option I'm talking about right now is option 2, where you get a live spot in my 8-week cohort, and that's described in the program details. But that's also paired with 6 months of coaching of twice per month Ask Samantha group calls. And so if you're interested in that, you can register here. And in either situation, we have a coupon running through Sunday called Fall 250, FALL 250. It's the first time in more than 5 years that I've offered a coupon code. But in the interest of knowing that a lot of people are needing some hand-holding support, I wanted to offer that coupon in case it's helpful. But then down here is where the 11 reasons emotionally intense kids act out. So with that, Connie, is there anything that you wanted to bring to the table today as a conversation, knowing that this is going to go out to at least 50 to 100 parents who signed up for this call?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, my 4-year-old, anytime that she's doing something wrong, um, and she gets corrected, she kind of she knows that she's doing it wrong, and I correct her, and then she just kind of has like a little smirk on her face, but she knows that she's like doing it wrong. Like I'll say, like, "Did you hit your sister?" And
Hmm.
she'll say, "Yeah." And then I say, "Well, you're not supposed to be hitting your sister."
Hmm.
And then I'll be like, "Well, go say that you're sorry." And then she'll, like, put her head down, kind of if she's sad, but she'll have a little smile or grin. and then she'll walk over and say, "I'm sorry,"
Mhm. Mhm.
and so she does that a lot. Um, and so she kind of knows that what she's doing is wrong, but then it's kind of like, she has kind of a smirk, kind of like, okay, I don't want to get in trouble type thing behind it.
Mhm.
And so I'm just like, okay. Even when I
Yeah.
did the 30-second timeout thing with her, like, every time you hit, you go to timeout thing, and then she go to timeout, and then she gets out, and then she'll do it again.
Yeah, yeah. And to the degree you feel comfortable, will you share with me, does she have any sensory challenges?
No.
Okay. The reason that I ask, just to like open it up for everybody to understand the context behind my question, is that
Uh,
sometimes hitting is a proprioception thing of like feeling somebody's body, and that can feel really grounding. And
uh,
so in the like natural phase of child development, like the natural stages of child development, at this young age, it can be an experiment, like the little scientist in the brain that you've heard me talk about, where the little scientist is testing what's going to happen if I do this one time, what's going to happen if I do it two times. So let me ask you a couple more questions. What happens when she comes out of, and as a clarification, it's really helpful to call it take a break or reset rather than a timeout. Because for kids who are testing the limits, if you call it a timeout, that feels like a punishment to them. I mean, it's going to feel like a punishment anyway if you have her take a break and you just call it a break instead of a timeout, because, kids don't want parents to take authority over them. But when you call it like you need to take a break and you need to reset, we're giving them language that invites them to develop more self control instead of that was naughty, I'm in charge. And that can sometimes be the fallback. The fallout can be, well, now that I'm done with my break, I'm going to try to take charge again because I don't like that feeling of being losing my control and authority. Does that make sense?
yes, that makes sense.
Okay, so that would be just one tweak I would talk about is like taking a break or taking a reset. So what happens when she goes back and hits that second time? What's your reaction?
Um, I usually just reminds her that, if she hits, she has to go, take a break or do a reset, and then she has to go back again.
Mm-hmm.
And then, usually, it kind of works for like a day or so. And then she has to be reminded again. But usually it's to the point where, it could be something of not hitting, and it could be something like, taking her older sister things and she knows she's not supposed to.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then her sister, will come and say, she took my things, and she's like, well, I had them first, and and I'm like, well, you're not supposed to take it, her things. But then
I
she has like a
see.
smirk on her, and then she has like a smirk on her face, like, and I'm like, you're not supposed to be taking her things, you know.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I got it. I got it. I hear you. Okay, so some of the frustration it sounds like is the smirk on her face. Because the
Yeah,
smirk on
because
her
she
face,
knows.
yeah. Well, here's what I'm
Uh-huh.
gonna say, because she's 4. So this is really typical at this phase of child development. Like this, I would say, is natural development, the things that she's doing right now. But the tricky thing about a smirk on a kid's face, or I hear from the parents where the child laughs at you when you try to enforce positive discipline, or they act like, well, I don't care if you enforce some kind of a consequence. I like to say what can save our sanity is if you actually just like that, um, ignore that affect, ignore that expression, because what it can do is it can cause a story inside of us where we say, my kid's intentionally pushing buttons, my kid's intentionally being a little whatever. Right? Like we take it really personally because we're like, oh, you know better. And I heard you say that a couple of times in the situation. Well, you know better. And yet at the same time, when kids are 4, the way that we move what they know to do, which is not grabbing, asking permission, safe hands, the way that they learn that is by really repetitive storytelling, where we highlight the positive experiences where the family is doing any of those 3 things. This could be, I don't know if your family meets at the dinner table at any time of day, but this could be a good uh, meal time conversation where the older kids and the grown-ups in the room get to share an example. Maybe you pick um, one of those 3 values: asking permission, sharing, safe hands, kind hands, something like that. Um, it's through storytelling that we can use positive reinforcements for kids to shift their behavior and not just using the discipline, because the discipline can trigger the stubborn or strong-willed child to do it more because it doesn't, they want to keep power. Discipline is not the only tool in our tool belt. And I see that you wrote in the chat box that you meet 5 out of 7 days. Great. Yeah. So it might be worth building in family values and telling stories about it. It would also be really interesting, Connie, to go back to class 2, where we talk about heartfelt appreciation, where you notice a moment where she's safe, she's asking permission, she's being kind, and for, the next 2 weeks, write those 3 words on a Post-it note along with the starter phrase, "When you, I feel because," and notice when she is doing that well. Oh, yeah, when you were playing, like, find a place where it's easy for her to do those, because the you language we say to our children become their inner I language. So you say, "Wow, when you were doing blah, 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 I felt really happy because it shows what a kind sister you are." Oh, yeah, that was really safe hands when you were around this animal or this baby or holding glass. Like, you walked that across the kitchen. I'm so proud of you. You have such calm, kind hands and body. So there's always ways of looking at um, kids' behavior and applying more than one tool. So the heartfelt appreciation, the storytelling around values, like positive behaviors you want to see, and not with a moral in mind. Like, so today when I was driving home and my husband cleaned the kitchen when I came in before I taught this webinar, I felt this because he's so kind and you should be kind too. It makes someone, it's more like, no, like legitimately, sincerely, what was something that somebody in the family did that was kind that day? And then the other piece that I would draw you to is looking at in class 7, you learned about conflict resolution. There's a sibling strategy where you can facilitate a conversation with your daughter about, like, how did that feel, and have the other child in the room. And how did that feel to you when she grabbed it and took it from you without asking? And, the 4-year-old might be like, "I felt fine." And the older kid might be like, "I was mad. They didn't ask permission." And so then you'd say, "Okay, so what would be something we could do differently to fix it?" And the older kid's going to be like, "Don't grab my stuff. How many times do I have to tell you? Ask for permission." And what the 4-year-old is going to need is they're going to need repetitive role play around these skills, because when you say you know better, she knows better, but she just started developing a bridge between her emotional brain and her logical brain. So when you say you know better, that's a logical parenting phrase. And um these 2 sides of the brain aren't even fully integrated until late 20s or 30. So as a 4-year-old, she at the age of 3 is when kids start developing beyond the emotional brain of life is all about me. So she's really early. So because you've been parenting for a while, I know, I would flag that for you as she kind of knows better, but now she's going to need a lot of practice, just like your older kids needed in that hand holding.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. All right. So let me see what would be a good wrap up for here today for us. So in starting with remembering what parenting was like that moment where parenting first felt hard to you, it might have been like my situation. Parenting was hard as soon as my kid was born because there was birth trauma. Like before I got a good night's rest on the first day of my child's life, it was like, whoa, what are we going to do with this shrieking cry around the clock? And for you, you might you're going to have your own experience that you recall. And what I was hoping to do on today's gathering is to normalize that when you have those hard moments, it's not that you're behind or you should have studied sooner or you're missing um, an inherent quality to be a good parent for your type of child. What it means is there are probably there's a learning and growth journey that parenting invites us onto. And in this space, I appreciate that journey. And I like to gather parents together so we don't feel alone in it. So, on the flip side of what you do matters and can add more fuel to the fire, the other thing is if you're listening to this, take heart in that what you do matters, right? So all of the other million moments that add together when you're parenting kids, when you're doing positive activities, when you're making sure they have the right school team, when you do online research, when you're processing with partners or friends or specialists about what you can do to make things better, like all of that matters too. And if there ever feels like a moment where you're like, this is the time that we need support, we need the tools, which is option one on my site, or we need the tools plus community support and coaching around it. That's what we're doing here and my website is SamanthaMoe.com. So thank you for sharing time with me today. We will leave it at that on this fall day. And I look forward to seeing you either at another gathering call when our technology and our Zoom reminder link goes out effectively. It didn't seem to have done that today. Or if you wanted to book a private call with me, that's also through my website, SamanthaMoe.com/parents. So at any time you can do that. I have a few spots a week too. I set aside for those calls and I speak to people internationally over Zoom. So thank you so much. Have a beautiful day. And I hope to talk to you in person soon. Bye.